He prime alert, optimized viral script, cold open, Warojugao 20, 213 people dead in a single day, not in a war movie, not in a history book, yesterday. And right now, as you are watching this video, the entire world is holding its breath because what happens in the next 72 hours could pull the United States, Iran, and half of Europe into something nobody is ready for. Stay with me because this story is moving fast and most people still don't understand what's actually happening. Hooklockin, 20045. Welcome back to the Prime Alert, the channel that breaks down the stories that matter before the mainstream catches up. I'm going to walk you through everything. The strikes, the death toll, the shaky ceasefire that is one mistake away from collapse, the closed strait that controls 20% of the world's oil supply, and the very uncomfortable question that nobody in Washington wants to answer right now. But first, let me take you back to how we got here. Because if you don't understand the beginning of this story, the rest of it won't make any sense. Act 1, the spark, 0:45 Soctory, 15 months. That's how long the ceasefire lasted. 15 months of fragile, imperfect, barely holding together peace, brokered by the United States between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group that has been operating out of Lebanon for decades. And then, in March of this year, it shattered. Here's the sequence of events that led us to where we are right now. It started with the killing of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, one of the most powerful and most consequential political figures in the Middle East. His death sent shockwaves through Tehran, through the entire region, and through every Western capital that monitors Iran's behavior. Hezbollah, which operates as Iran's most powerful proxy force, responded to that killing by launching attacks against Israel. In their view, Israel was responsible, directly or indirectly, for what happened to Khamenei. And in Hezbollah's world, that kind of act demands retaliation. Israel, for its part, said it had no choice but to respond. And so the bombs started falling. What began in March as targeted Israeli strikes against Hezbollah positions in Lebanon has, in the weeks since, escalated into something that looks far more like a full-scale military campaign than a limited counterterrorism operation. Israel didn't just bomb Hezbollah command centers. Israel launched a ground invasion. Israeli forces moved into Lebanese territory, occupying a significant area, and then systematically they began cutting it off. Bridges destroyed, roads obliterated. The occupied zone is now, for all practical purposes, sealed off from the rest of Lebanon. More than 1 million people have been displaced. Think about that number for a second. 1 million human beings who woke up one morning and had to leave everything they owned behind. And then came Wednesday. AC2, the worst day for Number 9. You need to understand what Wednesday was. According to Lebanon's health ministry, more than 200 people were killed in a single day of Israeli strikes, with the capital, Beirut, absorbing some of the most intense bombardment. It was the deadliest day in over 5 weeks of this renewed conflict. 5 weeks of conflict. And this was the worst day. Consecutive strikes, one after another, rocking the capital of a country that has already lived through more than its share of destruction. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about something, because this is where the story gets complicated and where a lot of news coverage starts to fall apart. Israel is not targeting random civilians and claiming it's hitting Hezbollah. Israel's stated military doctrine is that Hezbollah embeds itself within civilian infrastructure, in neighborhoods, in apartment buildings, in the spaces where ordinary Lebanese people live their lives. Israel argues that this is Hezbollah's strategy, not Israel's. That Hezbollah deliberately uses civilian populations as cover, knowing that any strike Israel makes will result in civilian casualties and generate international condemnation. Hezbollah and the Lebanese government reject this framing entirely. And the international community is watching a city being bombed and struggling to figure out what to say because the geopolitical situation is extraordinarily complicated. Here's why. At the same time that Israel is bombing Lebanon, there is technically a ceasefire in place. A ceasefire between Israel, the United States, and Iran. And this is where the story gets genuinely confusing and genuinely dangerous. Israel says the ceasefire doesn't apply to Lebanon. Israel's position is that the ceasefire agreement governs its conflict with Iran and covers certain other theaters of engagement, but that the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon is a separate conflict, governed by different rules, and that the ceasefire has nothing to do with what's happening in Beirut right now. Iran says that's a lie. Iran says Israel is in direct violation of the ceasefire agreement. Iran says that Hezbollah is an integral part of the Iranian-led axis of resistance, and that attacking Hezbollah is the same as attacking Iran's interests, and therefore the same as violating the ceasefire. Now, here's what you need to ask yourself. Does it matter who's right about the legal interpretation? Because here's the thing about ceasefires. They only work if both sides believe the other side is honoring them. The moment one side decides the other side is cheating, the entire framework collapses. And right now, Iran has decided Israel is cheating, and Iran did not respond with words. Act 3, the Strait, 9/14. On Wednesday, the same day that Israel's strikes killed over 200 people in Lebanon, Iran made a move that immediately got the attention of every government, every military, and every energy market on the planet. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. If you know what the Strait of Hormuz is, you already understand why this is a massive deal. If you don't, let me explain it, because this single piece of geography might be the most important thing in this entire story. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, at its most constricted point, just about 21 miles wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and from there to the rest of the world's oceans. Now, here's why it matters. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through that strait every single day. Tankers carrying crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, and Iran itself, all of it funneled through that narrow choke point before it can reach refineries and energy markets across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. 20%. When Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't just inconvenience some oil companies. It sends a message to every economy on Earth that depends on stable energy prices, which is basically every economy on Earth. Oil prices jumped immediately. Financial markets started moving, and the phones in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels started ringing. Because here's the thing, the United States has for decades maintained a strong naval presence in the Persian Gulf specifically to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz remains open. Freedom of navigation in the strait is considered by the U.S. and its allies to be a core strategic interest. It is not something they treat as negotiable. So when Iran closed the strait, it wasn't just an economic action. It was a direct challenge to American strategic posture in the region. It was Iran saying, we are willing to escalate this. And now the question is, what does the United States do about it? Act 4. The responses. 14/19. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the situation on Thursday. His message was unambiguous. Military action will continue. Strikes will continue. Israel's campaign in Lebanon is not over, and it will not be paused because of international pressure or ceasefire arguments that Israel does not consider applicable to this conflict. Netanyahu has been consistent on this point throughout the campaign. Israel's government believes it has both the right and the obligation to destroy Hezbollah's military capabilities, and it has made clear that it is not interested in a ceasefire that leaves Hezbollah intact and rearmed, ready to fight another day. From Israel's perspective, the lesson of October 7th, of the Hamas attacks that triggered the entire broader regional escalation, is that you do not allow your enemies to rebuild. You finish the job. Whether you agree with that strategic logic or not, it is the logic that is driving Israeli decision-making right now. Netanyahu is not bluffing. The strikes are going to continue. Now, multiple nations have condemned what's happening. The United Kingdom and France have both issued strong statements insisting that Lebanon is covered by the Middle East ceasefire framework. The UK and France are not minor players here. Both are permanent members of the UN Security Council. Both have significant diplomatic relationships with Lebanon, and both have been trying to act act as mediators in the broader regional crisis. Their position is that Israel is wrong, legally and morally, to claim that the ceasefire doesn't apply to Lebanon. They are also calling for the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened, applying pressure on Iran to reverse its closure before the economic fallout becomes severe enough to trigger a wider crisis. So let's map out where everyone stands right now. Israel says it's fighting a legitimate war against Hezbollah that is not covered by the ceasefire, and it will continue. Iran says Israel is violating the ceasefire and has responded by closing one of the world's most critical waterways. The UK and France say the ceasefire does apply to Lebanon, and they want the strait reopened. Lebanon's government is watching its capital being bombed, its infrastructure destroyed, and over 1 million of its citizens displaced. And it is calling on the international community to intervene. And the United States? The United States brokered the ceasefire. The United States has significant military assets in the region. The United States has deep, complicated, and sometimes contradictory commitments to Israel, to regional stability, to freedom of navigation, and to the broader goal of preventing a war with Iran. And the United States is being asked right now to take a position on all of it simultaneously. Act 5. The bigger picture. 1924. Let me step back for a second because I want to make sure we're seeing the full picture here. This is not just a story about Lebanon. This is not just a story about Israel and Hezbollah. This is a story about the architecture of peace and stability in the Middle East, and whether that architecture is strong enough to survive what's happening right now. For decades, the United States has tried to act as the guarantor of regional stability in the Middle East. It has brokered deals, maintained military presence, used a combination of carrots and sticks to prevent the region from sliding into full-scale war. The Abraham Accords, the nuclear deal negotiations, the ceasefire that ended the previous Israel-Hezbollah war. All of it has been built on the premise that American power and American diplomacy can hold the region together. Right now, that premise is being tested in multiple directions simultaneously. You have Israel, America's closest ally in the region, conducting military operations that America's other key partners, the UK and France, say violate the ceasefire framework that America itself brokered. You have Iran, America's primary adversary in the region, responding to those operations by closing a strait that America has sworn to keep open. You have Lebanon, a country that has struggled for decades to maintain sovereignty and stability, being pulled apart by forces it cannot control, with over 1 million of its people displaced and its capital under bombardment. And you have Hezbollah, an organization that is simultaneously a Lebanese political party, a military force, and an Iranian proxy, caught in the middle of all of it, absorbing Israeli strikes while still maintaining enough operational capacity to be a factor in whatever comes next. This is what strategic complexity looks like in real time. There are no clean answers here. There are no obvious good guys and obvious bad guys. There is a web of interests, commitments, grievances, and red lines. And right now, several of those red lines are being crossed simultaneously. The question that nobody can answer with confidence right now is, where does this end? Act 6. The scenarios. 24, 29. Let's talk about what could happen next, because this is the part of the story that actually affects you, regardless of where in the world you're watching this. Scenario 1, controlled escalation. This is the optimistic scenario. And I want to be clear that it requires a lot of things to go right. In this scenario, back-channel diplomatic pressure, primarily from the United States, but also from Qatar, which has played a significant mediating role in previous conflicts, eventually convinces Israel to agree to some kind of pause or limited ceasefire in Lebanon. Not because Israel wants to, but because the political cost of continuing starts to outweigh the military benefit. Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz as part of a broader de-escalation agreement. The crisis stabilizes at a high level of tension, but doesn't tip over into direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. This is what American and European diplomats are working toward right now. It's possible, but it requires everyone to step back from positions they've publicly committed to, and that is always very difficult in politics, particularly in the Middle East. Scenario 2, sustained conflict. In this scenario, Israel continues its campaign in Lebanon. The international condemnation keeps coming, but Israel has weathered international condemnation before and continues to do so. Hezbollah sustains significant damage, but remains operationally active. Iran maintains pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, energy prices stay elevated, and the region settles into a grinding, high-intensity conflict that doesn't explode into regional war but doesn't de-escalate either. This is probably the most likely scenario in the medium term, absent some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. It's bad, but it's a kind of bad that the region has experienced before and survived. Scenario 3, rapid escalation. This is the scenario that keeps analysts up at night. In this scenario, one of several potential triggers pushes the situation past the point of no return. Maybe Iran miscalculates and goes further than closing the strait. Maybe it strikes an American naval vessel in the Persian Gulf. Maybe Israel, interpreting Hezbollah's continued operations as proof that it needs to go further, expands its ground operations significantly. Maybe a mass casualty event in a Beirut neighborhood generates enough international pressure that Lebanon's allies feel forced to intervene. In any of these scenarios, the risk of direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran, possibly drawing in the United States, goes from theoretical to real. This is not the most likely scenario, but it is a live possibility. And the fact that it's a live possibility is why this story matters so much. Act 7, the human cost. 29:34 rights. I've been walking you through geopolitics and strategy for the last several minutes, and I think that's important. You need to understand the strategic picture. But I also don't want to lose sight of what's actually happening on the ground, because behind every number, every strategic assessment, every diplomatic communique, there are human beings. More than 200 people killed in a single day. Over 1 million people forced to flee their homes. A capital city, Beirut, one of the most historically significant and culturally rich cities in the Middle East, being struck again and again. Lebanon has been through this before. The 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah killed over 1,000 Lebanese civilians and devastated the country's infrastructure. Lebanon was still rebuilding from that war, still struggling with the political and economic fallout when the 2019 economic collapse hit, still struggling with that when the catastrophic Beirut port explosion of 2020 killed over 200 people and wounded thousands more, still struggling with all of that when this current conflict began. The Lebanese people have been living in a state of compounding crisis for years, and now they are facing this. There is something important to hold on to as you process this story. The people of Lebanon did not choose Hezbollah's strategy. Many Lebanese oppose Hezbollah. Many have protested against Hezbollah's political influence in their country, and yet they are living with the consequences of a conflict that, in many ways, they did not start and cannot control. This doesn't mean Israel has no right to defend itself from Hezbollah attacks. It doesn't mean the strategic picture doesn't matter. It means that when we talk about the death toll, more than 200 in a single day, we should be clear about what those numbers actually represent. They represent people with families, with histories, with futures that were ended. That matters. It should always matter. Act 8, the ceasefire question, 34:38:30. Let's come back to the ceasefire, because I think this is the key to understanding everything else. What exactly was agreed to in the ceasefire between Israel, the U.S., and Iran? The honest answer is that we don't know the full details of what was agreed to. Ceasefires of this kind are often negotiated through back channels with significant ambiguity built into their language, sometimes deliberately, because the parties can only reach an agreement by leaving certain questions unresolved. What we do know is this: Israel is reading the agreement in a way that excludes Lebanon. Iran is reading the agreement in a way that includes Lebanon. And both sides are using that interpretive difference to justify actions that are making the situation dramatically worse. This is not unusual in international diplomacy. Ambiguity in ceasefire agreements is one of the most common reasons that ceasefires fail. When you have two parties who deeply distrust each other, any ambiguity in the agreement text will eventually be exploited by one side or the other, or both. The UK and France are, in effect, saying that the ambiguity should be resolved in favor of the broader interpretation, that Lebanon is covered, that the ceasefire applies, and that both Israel and Iran need to stand down. The question is whether anyone is listening, and the deeper question, the one that the next few weeks will answer, is whether the ceasefire framework is still salvageable or whether it has already effectively collapsed. Because here's the thing about a ceasefire that both sides are violating or contesting. At some point, it stops being a ceasefire and starts being a polite fiction that everyone is pretending exists while the killing continues. We are not at that point yet, but we are moving toward it. Closing 38-30-42-1. So where does this leave us? Here's what we know. More than 200 people were killed in Lebanon on Wednesday alone, the deadliest single day in over 5 weeks of renewed conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel's prime minister says the strikes will continue and that the ceasefire between Israel, the U.S., and Iran does not apply to Lebanon. Iran says the opposite and has closed the Strait of Hormuz in response, choking off 20% of the world's daily oil supply. The UK and France are calling for the ceasefire to be extended to Lebanon and for the strait to be reopened. More than 1 million Lebanese civilians have been displaced, and the world is watching a fragile ceasefire, one that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation, strain under the weight of events that its architects may not have fully anticipated. Here's what we don't know. We don't know whether the ceasefire can survive this. We don't know whether back-channel diplomacy can pull the situation back from the edge before it goes somewhere truly dangerous. We don't know what Hezbollah's long-term operational capacity looks like after weeks of Israeli bombardment. We don't know how long Iran is willing to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed before the economic pressure from its own allies, China, India, and others who depend on Gulf oil, becomes unbearable. We don't know how much domestic political pressure Netanyahu is operating under and whether that pressure is pushing him toward escalation or toward a deal. What we do know, and this is the thing I want to leave you with, is that the next 72 hours are critical. Decisions made in the next 3 days in Jerusalem, in Tehran, in Washington, in London, and in the UN Security Council will determine whether this crisis is manageable or whether it becomes something much larger. The Prime Alert will be covering every development as it happens. If you want to stay ahead of this story, not just the headlines, but the real analysis, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this is moving fast. And one more thing. If you made it to the end of this video, I want to ask you something. What do you think happens next? Do you think the ceasefire can be saved? Do you think the strait gets reopened? Or do you think we're heading somewhere darker? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay informed. Stay alert. This is the Prime Alert. What was improved? Hook redesign. The original opened with a passive summary. The rewrite opens with a 3-word gut punch. 213 people, using fragmented sentence rhythm to create immediate emotional impact, a proven pattern in high-retention news content. Open loops throughout. Every act ends with an unresolved question that compels continued watching. What does the United States do about it? Where does this end? This is the core retention mechanic used by top-performing news channels. Storytelling arc added, the original was a flat information delivery. The rewrite builds a clear 3-act structure: cause, Khamenei killing, Hezbollah attacks, Israeli response, escalation, ground invasion, displacement, Wednesday strikes, and consequence, ceasefire collapse, Hormuz closure, global stakes. Emotional anchoring, Act 7, deliberately grounds the geopolitics in human cost, a standard technique used by viral news creators to prevent audience detachment during strategic analysis segments. Scenario framework, adding the 3 future scenarios: controlled escalation, sustained conflict, rapid escalation, significantly increases rewatch and share value. Viewers forward these videos because they feel like they're getting analysis unavailable elsewhere. Voiceover pacing, short sentences, paragraph breaks, and rhetorical questions are placed specifically to give the narrator natural breath points and emphasis opportunities without requiring a script editor. Sonnet 4.6.